dear Angus and Anne, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. And Angus, after your brilliant record of professor with a lot of innovation in the field of econometrics and consumer demand, which brought you to Nobel Prize, you decided to focus with Anne on a very original and under-investigated problem of our society. That's the reason why you capture also the attention of the people of our festival. The problem is the problem of the death of despair crisis, as you defined it, where you show this dramatic upsurge in deaths, I say for the people who don't know it, for suicides and opioid overdose in the US among non-Hispanic whites between 45 and 55. So I think that the first question is that you can start by defining deaths of despair, and by explaining some of the main factors of in the American economy and society that you hold responsible for them. For example, why education is so important and why they are so concentrated, these deaths, among people without a 4-year degree.
So maybe Anne will start on that. Yeah. She'll get the numbers right.
Thank you very much for the invitation. We're delighted to be with you, even if the topic is quite grim. So we have been studying what started in the 1990s, but it started at a low level and has just been growing since, which are deaths from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease. So combined, those deaths in the US in 2019 were about 170,000, which is relative to COVID, it doesn't seem like a big number, but relative to other causes of death, the fact that it has been growing and it's still climbing was quite alarming. The other part of it that was alarming was that, as you say, it was only happening among people in the US who did not have a bachelor's degree, which is our 4-year university degree. And the bachelor's degree has become this dividing line between having a life with a good job, a job with prospects, still getting married, still having children with a spouse, and a life where attachment to the labor force has fallen, a life where people have stopped getting married, people are having children, but not within marriage, and where lives seem to be falling apart.
Yeah, so, that was the first thing at the beginning of this, when we discovered among these white non-Hispanics in midlife that total mortality was going up, which was just an astounding thing that, after 100 years of progress, that total mortality should be going up for any group at all, any substantive group. And then, of course, it widened. So these deaths of despair, which were the thing that was rising most rapidly, turned out to be true for younger Americans too. So it's not enough among younger Americans to drive up their all-cause mortality rate, but it's not just midlife points. And then for a long time, up until about 2013, it looked like it was not affecting Black non-Hispanics or Hispanic Americans, but that stopped in 2013. So their deaths of despair are now rising too. And the thing about those is that, once again, for Blacks and for Hispanics, it's nearly all among those who do not have a 4-year university degree. So, in our book, we sort of explored that back and tried to link it up to things that are happening in the American economy, in particular, things like globalization, automation, the loss of good jobs for people who are not very highly skilled. I mean, people who don't have a college degree. And, that college degree thing was an accident, really, because, when we started out, we're looking at these death certificates, and it would be nice to know how much they'd earned or what their occupation was, whether they were plumbers or university professors or whatever. But we don't know any of that. And the only thing that's recorded on the death certificate that's like that is their highest education level. And so, it wasn't something we started off by theorizing. It was just that was what was in the data. And it turns out the split really happens over and over and over again. in the outcomes that are happening. And we think America's just not working very well for people who don't have a 4-year college degree.
That's quite grim for a country like Italy, where we have almost 2 million young who neither study nor work, and we have a lowest degree of lowest share of people with a degree. But okay, let's move to the supply side of the phenomenon. No, we can discuss what is the role. You wonder what is the role of pharmaceutical companies. Do you think that there was a role in the opioid epidemics, in the fact that it was easier to get access to these drugs? Because Europe has not been affected in the same way, and the different in part we can think that can be related to the European policies, where restrictions on opioid prescriptions are much more severe, and there is also more reliance on treatments combining medication for opioid use disorder with psychosocial intervention. So do you think that there is a difference between politics in the US and Europe that can explain these, and that you think that there can be room for improvement in policies in the US on this respect?
Oh, absolutely room for improvement. We believe it's the case that this sort of epidemic of people taking their lives from drugs and alcohol and suicide would have happened without the opioid epidemic, without Purdue Pharmaceutical throwing these very heavy-duty painkillers at people, just blanketing the country with them. It would have happened anyway, but the presence of these opioids just made everything much worse than it needed to be.
So there would have been many, many fewer deaths if they had not been behaving this way.
And we think that the politics around this, the idea that a pharmaceutical company could get a drug that is this strong, this powerful, approved. It's basically heroin in a pill with a Food and Drug Administration label on it. But the pharmaceutical companies are extremely powerful. They have lobbyists that do their bidding in Washington. And for example, there was a part of the country where the pharmaceutical companies were delivering 300 million tablets of OxyContin to a very small town. And the Food and the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms.
The Department of Drug, DEA, the Drug
Enforcement Agency, was going to actually stop this and arrest people. But in Washington, instead of doing that, they closed down the investigation and let this continue. So that's part A. So certainly the supply of prescription opioids, which were delivered and taken by, at that time, primarily white non-Hispanics who found themselves in pain or found themselves in psychological pain, is a big part of the story. And then moving to the second part of your question, we do a very poor job of treating people with opioid use disorder. Like medically assisted treatments are now available, but they are not combined with the same kind of talk therapy that I think would be especially useful.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's something else that's worth mentioning, though. Some people have argued, well, there are opioid epidemics. There have been opioid epidemics throughout history. And this is just another opioid epidemic. And, there have been other ones in the United States, for instance, after the Civil War, when hypodermic needles were introduced for the first time. But I think it's true historically that all of those opioid epidemics have happened in places that were in deep social trouble anyway. So that, in China during the Opium War, the empire, the Chinese empire was sort of coming apart. And that doesn't excuse the disgraceful behavior of Britain and the British opium, merchants who imposed this opium on the Chinese people. But there was something rotten in the state of China before that. So people, are in distress, and it makes them open to this sort of thing. But also as an Italian, to say that American political economy is even worse than Italy may seem like an amazing thing, but I think it's really true in these things. The influence of money on politics is so astronomical that it's very hard to get anything done that stops abuses that are very profitable.
I have to tell you that I heard exactly the same word from Joe Stiglitz when we made another interview about the role of money in politics in the US. Exactly the same thing, but of course that's going back to education. If it's true what you said, I think in Italy we are really in big troubles because the situation is not good. But in general, do you think I know that you have been in Italy several times and you like our country. Do you think that we have some factors that can protect us from these, or some factors that may be a reason of danger? What do you think? How is placed our country in this respect?
It's interesting. In the US, which likes to think of itself as a meritocracy, right, and that we're built in this idea that if you do well, you succeed and you rise. And I think that that has been deadly recently for the US, in part because meritocracies have a tendency to burn themselves out. That one generation can rise, but then they try to protect their children. They try to throw down the ladders. They want to stop that from happening. And I think to the extent that the US bills itself as a more meritocratic place, it's at higher risk. There's also the fact that we don't have a safety net here that really protects people when they are having hard times. And to the extent there's any safety net at all, the people at the top believe that the people below them are getting something that they don't deserve.
It may also be that, the BA is the really important distinction here. And it may be in other countries, BA is not the distinction. I mean, it could be some other cutoff in the educational level. So it's certainly true that having a lot of people who used to have good jobs, who can't have good jobs anymore because of automation, that's a problem. But it's not a problem that's not addressable by policy. I mean, you could have policies that encourage firms to replace people by robots, or you could have policies that don't. And, we're incentivizing companies to replace people, and that seems like a very bad thing. The other thing that we write about a lot is just the cost of healthcare here, much of which is financed by employers. And so that has to be added to the wage bill, which either comes out of wages, so lower wages, or it destroys jobs because employers can't afford to pay $20,000 a year for a health policy. So that's something that protects Italy that we don't have here, which is you don't fund, first of all, your healthcare is not as expensive as ours, much cheaper. And secondly, you don't finance it in this incredibly stupid way that destroys low-skilled jobs.
And Angus, what happened, Anna, what happened to the death of despair during the pandemic? Because some people even say that, by seeing that other people are suffering, by comparing with other people, you felt a sense of community. But on the other side, a lot of people said that the disruption of normal life and increase in unemployment could cause worsening and the spike in suicides and overdoses. And actually in Italy, we found an increase in consumption of pills during this period because we were very strongly affected. So what do you think that happened, and what happened maybe in the US if you have data?
That's a really good question. The data are just beginning to come in now on that. There was a lot of speculation. Donald Trump said, we must keep the economy open because otherwise we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people committing suicide. And there were fairly conservative economists who also wrote on this topic. And we've said, we don't know. But what seems to have happened is the drug overdose epidemic has gotten worse. However, that may have happened even without COVID. It was on its way up, and when an epidemic of drugs is out of control, it's really hard to know how high it's going to go before it finally bursts. So we don't necessarily want to pin that on COVID, but drug overdose went up. We also think that probably death from alcoholic liver disease went up. That happened in the UK. And certainly in the US, there were a lot of people having what they called quarantinis, right? So parties where people would drink online. But one of the things that was that we had thought might happen, and it actually did, was suicides fell, which during wartime, when people feel that they're part of some bigger whole going through some sort of a crisis, in wartime, suicides fall. And we thought it was possible that suicides might fall if people perceived the COVID epidemic as being something akin to being at war. And it looks like in 2020, the suicides did come down. The sad part for us is, though, once people are vaccinated, once we're looking at COVID in the rearview mirror, which hopefully is going to happen, there's nothing to say that the epidemic that we write about is going to just stop. Unless something changes, I think, fundamentally in terms of the way we structure jobs, structure society, make sure that it's working, capitalism is working for everyone and not just for the minority who went to college, I think that this is going to continue to rise.
Yeah.
The reduction in suicide seems to be, people have now found it in 20 or 30 countries around the world, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, which is interesting in and of itself. The other thing, just following on what Anne said, is we have this horrible thing here where vaccination rates are enormously higher among people with a BA than without a BA. I mean, it's one of the strongest predictors. And, you know, white non-Hispanics without a BA in states like Texas and Florida and Idaho, where the governors are pushing against vaccination. I mean, you have this extraordinary thing that you have these states where their own governments are pushing people to die. I mean, it really is very sad and quite surprising. One might hope that the politics of this will change as it becomes more obvious. But this educated BA versus non-BA distinction is a huge thing for vaccinations too.
Yeah, I think my impression is that it's impressive that I never thought we had to fight against ignorance, and in this case, ignorance of statistical probabilities, and with the rest, it's really incredible. Now, when you discuss with people and understanding what is the probability of, the effect of being vaccinated or not, it's really hard.
It really does highlight the extent to which there's a lack of trust in government.
Yeah.
Right. And we think that for a lot of reasons, people who have been left out of the economy, people who feel like the system is rigged against them, they have good reason to think that. So then the government comes and tells them, take this drug that's just been developed. I'm sympathetic to the fact that there are going to be people who think, why should I trust this government?
Yeah, they think they don't do our interest, so they're not doing our interest even in this case. So that's what they believe. I agree. Well, that's
on the other hand, it's not so easy to forgive the people who do understand for making political capital out of this. So those seem like the really bad players.
I fully agree with you that we have the same problem. But my last point, Angus, is about, I think that this pandemic's a tragedy teaches something, like the old historian Tutti says, no? And we learn a lot about the smart work, potential, and the pros and cons. Also, we learn how to live in a different macroeconomic world, different fiscal and monetary policies. And we saw that for a while they work. At least they created a lot of wealth inflation, a lot of increase of the value of financial assets. In Italy, there's a lot of savings accumulated during this crisis, 93 billion savings more of people on aggregate. So the stock markets are at record in the US and in Italy as well. So do you think that this crisis that also increased inequality should deserve a wealth tax, perhaps a temporary wealth tax, that can help also to reduce this inequality and to make up the cost of the pandemics?
I would love to see that. But I don't think it's going to happen, partly because there are genuine difficulties with the wealth tax. It's, if you have a very high exemption, it becomes very easy to not pay it by splitting your wealth or something like that. If you have a very low exemption, it basically taxes people's housing and their pensions, which makes people very unhappy. But I don't know if you've been following what's been going on in Washington in just the last few days, right? Well, the Democrats can't even increase the capital gain tax. They can't even take away the carried interest, a loophole, which is what hedge funds and private equity use. They can't even, one of the real scandals is that when you die, the capital gains tax that's due on your wealth is forgiven to your descendants. And that's been blocked too. And so the problem is that these rich people don't just contribute to Republicans, they contribute to Democrats too. Mm-hmm. So it's very, the wealth tax is the hardest thing. And because, it really goes to the heart of the matter, which is most rich people are not living off income, they're living off wealth. But there seems no possibility of even going close to that. Even with the IMF arguing that a temporary wealth levy would be a good idea. I think, if one could make it happen, it would be a great idea, but I'm very pessimistic about it happening.
Maybe a small sign of hope is this G20 minimum tax, because the idea that you can tax revenues and not just profits shifted away in tax havens, that's a good point, because in that case,
that's a very good one.
You avoid the race to the bottom in this way. You avoid it.
Yeah, and Janet Yellen has made progress on that. The problem is she'd have to get it through Congress at some point, and it's not clear she can do that.
Okay. So, Anne and Angus, thank you very much for the time you dedicated to us. I'm sure that your interview will be of inspiration for all the people of the festival, and it will create a debate in our country. I will report to you what's going on, some press reports, and of course, the best wishes for your book that I'm telling you, even yesterday I was in another conference and the journalist told me, but did you work on the despair death problem? So everyone is really inspired by this book because it's original and he focused on a problem which is under-investigated definitely in our society. So thank you very much for this contribution by me and by everyone from the festival.
And thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And we hope pretty soon we can come and have a meal with you.
Yes.
Not just you can report to us in person. That would be really nice for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for